The stranger walked in just past midnight, dragging something dark behind him. How it moved was wrong, like nothing natural. The man himself moved strangely too. The staff at the front desk felt uneasy right away. He walked stiffly, one leg dragging a bit, like a scarecrow stumbling. A dusty cowboy hat hid his dirty hair, and his boots clanked on the floor. Later, when I watched the security tapes, I saw his thin grin and crooked teeth. It looked like he was about to laugh, but it never reached his eyes. He tugged in a huge black Rottweiler, practically pulling the dog across the floor. The cameras caught no sound, but my co-workers told me what he said. "This one's acting real weird." He filled out our intake forms. I noticed on his paperwork that his address was for some far-off warehouse, and his name was fake-sounding, Clint. No records anywhere. But the dog's name, Buddy, seemed real enough. Something about this pair made me uneasy. It wasn't routine for me to snoop on client info, but something had been bothering me over the past few nights, and now I felt the need to be cautious. After he turned in the forms, he sat down, still keeping Buddy at his side. He leaned against the wall like a lifeless prop, hardly moving. Buddy, the Rottweiler, also barely moved, just sat there as if waiting. We meet all kinds of people during night shifts, some kind souls and some odd ones. But this man? He set off quiet alarms in my head. I went to bring them into an exam room. At first, he didn't notice me, like he was lost in thought. Then a smell hit me. Stale cigarettes, gasoline, and under that, something worse, like spoiled meat. The dog looked blank, almost like someone had hollowed it out. It drooled steadily, a puddle forming beneath its mouth. I introduced myself calmly. "How can we help Buddy tonight?" Clint didn't answer at first. He stared upward as if watching an invisible bug in the air. Finally, he muttered, "Oh, he just ain't acting right. Ain't eating much. Usually pet owners might get chatty, offering too many details. Not him." After those words, he stayed silent, still gazing above us, greasy hair partly covering his face. When I crouched to check Buddy's heart rate, the moment my fingers touched the dog's fur, a terrible feeling crept over me. My stomach knotted like before a lightning strike. Buddy's vital signs were normal, steady heartbeat and breathing, but its skin felt cold, only 97 degrees, lower than normal for a dog. I pinched a bit of its skin to check hydration, slightly slow, indicating mild dehydration. Lifting its lip to inspect the gums, I had the strong feeling I was too close to something I shouldn't be. The gums were pale and Buddy's eyes drilled into me, pupils wide and dark. Buddy wasn't growling or baring teeth. It just watched me, almost like it was holding itself back. That heavy sense of wrongness churned my stomach. Suddenly, Clint spoke behind me, voice low and serious. "Don't turn away from him." I stopped and glanced back. "Pardon me?" His tone stayed even. "If you're gonna step away, do it facing him, else something bad could happen." I took a deep breath, trying not to show annoyance. He'd let me examine Buddy up close without a word, and only now he warns me the dog could be dangerous. This whole situation felt worse by the minute. This odd man, his unsettling dog, and the sour feeling in my gut. Carefully, I backed off while still facing Buddy. The dog's eyes tracked me intensely, like I was prey, like I was just meat standing there. A short time later, Dr. Morris, our seasoned on-call vet, stepped in. He exchanged only a few words with Clint before suggesting we run some tests and keep Buddy overnight on fluids to warm him up and rehydrate him. Clint kept that half smile on his face like this was all some joke, but he agreed and signed the consent forms to move Buddy into our treatment area. I looped a muzzle on him as a precaution. That's when I realized Buddy wouldn't walk on his own. Earlier, Clint had dragged him, but now Buddy wasn't limping or weak. I could see it in his eyes. He was choosing not to move. I signaled for my colleague Mark to help carry the heavy dog. Mark lifted Buddy without fuss, but we exchanged a look. We both sensed it. Something wasn't right, not with the dog, not in the air around us. We laid Buddy on the treatment table to draw blood from his neck vein. He didn't flinch, didn't fight it at all. Mark held Buddy's head steady, and I slid the needle in. Dark blood filled the syringe. Blood draws from limp animals should be quick, but Buddy's blood felt oddly thick and slow. The blood felt unnaturally cold even through the syringe. I ran the sample through our lab machines. Slight dehydration, maybe a hint of pancreatitis, but nothing major. Nothing to explain Buddy's chill. We settled Buddy into a heated kennel, covered him with blankets, and connected the IV fluids. I felt a wave of relief when Clint finally left the clinic. That was 3 nights ago. That night turned out surprisingly quiet. Unusual for an overnight animal hospital. We only had one other dog staying over, a cattle dog recovering from stomach surgery and doing well. Normal signs, eating fine, alert and friendly. A couple of hours later, I went to check on our patients. I found the cattle dog dead. The scene was horrifying. The poor dog had ripped open its own surgical stitches. Somehow it had pawed off its protective cone and then viciously attacked its own belly. This wasn't normal post-surgery behavior. It was self-mutilation. Even as its insides were spilling out, the cattle dog had kept tearing at itself as if trying to kill something inside. The floor was slick with blood, streaming toward the drain. It was so red and thick it looked almost alive as it swirled away. The kennel walls and even the ceiling were smeared with gore. I'd never seen an animal harm itself like this. I froze, heart pounding, trying to process the carnage. The cattle dog's open eyes were blank and lifeless, reflecting the cold light above. And then I noticed, in a kennel 2 spaces down, Buddy was sitting up, looking straight at the mess. Buddy sat perfectly still, IV dripping fluid into his paw, the heater by him softly humming. His lips pulled back, almost like a grin. No panting, no whine, just that grin. His eyes caught the light, and for a sickening moment, they looked human. Dr. Morris came to see what happened. I overheard him call the cattle dog's owner. The owner's heartbroken cries echoed through the halls. In all my years here, I'd seen pet deaths, but this felt different, too violent, too strange, like something had pushed that dog to do the unthinkable. Afterward, the mood in the clinic turned heavy. We cleaned up in silence, shock hanging over us. Every time any of us passed Buddy's kennel with a blood-soaked towel or walked by carrying the cattle dog's sealed body bag, Buddy's head slowly turned to follow. He watched every move as we mopped and scrubbed away the red stains. It didn't feel like we were getting a breather in the quiet, more like the calm before an even worse storm. A few hours later, long after we'd cleared away the gruesome scene, I heard a beeping from the kennel area. Buddy's IV pump was sounding an alarm down the hall. I didn't want to go back there alone, so I grabbed Mark to come with me. We found Buddy awake, sitting still. We had to readjust his IV line, which he'd crimped under a paw. He stayed eerily calm as we put a fresh muzzle on him to be safe. Too calm. His eyes followed our hands as we fixed the tubing. Only his eyes moved, dark and unblinking. As we turned to leave, the light above Buddy's kennel started flickering. At first it was faint. Then it flickered more intensely and abruptly went out, throwing the room into shadows. Mark and I froze in place. Only a dim light from the hallway gave any visibility. We looked at each other, neither wanting to say what we were thinking. The air itself felt different, thick and humming, like just before a thunderstorm. Without warning, the two overhead lights above Buddy's kennel burst to life, blazing unnaturally bright, then fizzled out with a pop. Darkness swallowed the room. Before we could react, Buddy moved. Mark's back was turned and Buddy lunged, slamming his weight against the kennel door. The door rattled and Buddy, muzzle strapped on, lunged out as the door gave way. He rammed into Mark's side like a cannonball. Mark yelled in surprise and pain. Buddy was silent, but I heard the horrible clack of his jaws snapping under the muzzle, spit flying out. Mark stumbled, trying to regain his footing. I acted on pure instinct. I threw the kennel door fully open, hoping to startle Buddy off. Buddy charged into Mark again, even harder, knocking him down. Mark rolled and flailed, trying to push Buddy off. The second Mark faced Buddy and looked him in the eye. Buddy suddenly stopped moving. He stood there in the darkness, quiet and still, just watching Mark. The only sound was Mark's panicked breathing and the drip of IV fluid on the floor. Something was very wrong with Buddy. This wasn't a typical medical issue or behavioral problem. It felt deeper, more primal. The dog felt aware. Mark was shaken to his core, and I was too. We didn't speak about what happened. We just backed out slowly and left Buddy alone, locking the kennel securely. The rest of the night, I handled other cases. A tiny dog with pneumonia, a cat with seizures, another with a neurological issue. I went through the motions, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Buddy. Mark looked shattered, sitting quietly with a vacant stare. It wasn't just the shock or pain from being hit. It felt like something in him had cracked, something unseen. When the shift finally ended, Mark slipped out without a word, not even a goodbye wave. I sat in my car afterward, my hands shaking so badly I smoked 2 cigarettes to steady them. Before heading home, I made sure my pistol was in my purse. It was. At home, I slid it under my pillow. As dawn light seeped in, I fell into a troubled sleep and dreamt horrible things. In my nightmare, a black shape loomed in the dark, sniffing around my bed. Its eyes were empty voids, and when it bit me, it wasn't quick or aggressive. It pressed its teeth in slowly, one by one, puncturing my skin as I lay paralyzed. I woke up soaked in sweat. The next night at work, as soon as I walked by Buddy's kennel, I felt a wave of disappointment crash over me. Disappointment that Buddy was still here. He sat with his heater blowing warm air and watched me. The lights in his corner were still burned out, and now the ones nearby flickered on and off. Mark had called in sick. The supervisor said he'd been vomiting all day. I suspected there was more to it, but I had no time to ask. I texted Mark to get well soon. He read it, but didn't answer. We also tried reaching Clint, the man who left Buddy with us, for an update and to push him to pick up his dog. His phone was disconnected. He had paid only half of his bill in crisp old $100 bills on admission, and now it seemed obvious he wouldn't pay the rest or come back. Buddy was effectively abandoned. We got slammed with cases that night. I told my manager something was off with Buddy, and we shouldn't kennel other dogs near him. But space was tight. Our small dog ward on the far side was full, so a Great Dane with liver issues had to be housed in the large dog ward, the same ward as Buddy. I put the Dane in the kennel furthest from Buddy, which happened to be near where the cattle dog had died. Minutes later, I went to double check on them. My heart nearly stopped. Buddy's kennel door was wide open. The latch was undone, hanging open. Buddy was out of his IV, sitting at the kennel's threshold. No leash on, nothing restraining him, just staring into the dark room, mouth slack. I felt a surge of fear and quickly shut the kennel door, latching it tight. I hurried out, grabbed 2 bowls of food, and went back. One for Buddy, one for the Dane. As I set the bowls down, I was hit with nausea and dread. Buddy's door was open again. I hadn't even left the room or heard any sound, but there he was, free, sitting there calmly. These kennel latches needed thumbs to open, and Buddy's paws sure didn't have those. I slammed the door shut again, hands shaking, and this time I secured it with a carabiner clip as an extra lock. I slid the bowls under the kennels, special diet food for the sick Dane, and a recovery food for Buddy. I was about to leave when a noise stopped me cold. It wasn't a bark or a whine. It sounded wet, like someone trying to talk underwater, a thick, gurgling attempt at words. The hairs on my neck rose. I turned around slowly. Buddy was just sitting there, silent now, staring. The air felt charged like static electricity. Then I realized the Great Dane had started crying in his kennel. His food lay untouched, spilled on the floor. The Dane's fur bristled, and he pressed himself into the back of his kennel, eyes darting upward as if sensing something I couldn't see. A chill ran through me. I felt it too, a heavy dread. When I reached for the kennel bars to calm him, the Dane's crying stopped abruptly. He began trembling, and his whimper morphed into a deep wail, like a distant tornado siren rising and cutting off. Then he went completely still, which somehow felt worse. Without warning, the Dane lunged at his own leg, biting down with a ferocity that didn't seem possible. There was no tentative gnawing or injured yelp. He was savaging himself, hard. The crack of bone echoed as he broke his own leg under his teeth. Blood sprayed across the floor. This wasn't normal behavior from a dog in pain or panic. It was like he was destroying himself on purpose. I knew better than to jump in alone. A dog in such a state could easily attack me next. I turned and bolted, shouting for backup down the hallway. My voice was shrill with panic as I called for help. Dr. Morris and 2 techs, Jane and Paula, dashed out from an exam room when they heard me. I snatched a long catch pole, a tool for restraining dangerous animals, from the wall. We all ran back. The sight was gruesome. The Dane was still tearing at his leg, which was now just hanging by strips of skin and muscle. Blood pumped out in spurts in time with his heartbeat, splashing across the floor and onto the walls. I opened the kennel door carefully. Using the catch pole, I looped the noose around the Dane's neck and tightened it, pulling his head away to stop him from inflicting more harm. He snapped at the air wildly, eyes glazed, but there was no recognition in them, no anger, nothing, like he wasn't even there. Then he bit down on the metal pole itself, hard, not out of self-defense or fear, it seemed, but out of some distorted instinct, as if even metal might need to be destroyed. The sound was stomach-turning, his teeth cracking and shattering against the pole. Shards of teeth fell to the bloody floor. His leg was a mangled ruin, flesh in ribbons, bone exposed stark white through the red. Still, he thrashed and bit, relentless. Dr. Morris arrived with a sedative syringe, but by the time we could even get it into the Dane, his massive body began to weaken. He collapsed in the slippery pool of his own blood, still twitching and chewing as his life ebbed. His eyes rolled up, then became fixed and empty. He was gone. I stood there shaking, lowering the catch pole. Over the lifeless Dane's body, I saw Buddy in his kennel, lips drawn back, teeth bared in what looked like a twisted smile. I snapped. "How long is that dog staying here?" I shouted, pointing at Buddy. My voice was higher and harsher than I intended. Dr. Morris frowned at me. His white coat was soaked with blood, his face drawn with exhaustion and shock. He replied sharply, "We have bigger problems." Another pet just died in our care in a horrible way. That's 2 in as many days. Forget that dog for a second. I have to call yet another owner and tell them their pet died. And I don't even have an explanation. He wiped blood off his hands onto his sleeve and rubbed his eyes. He looked utterly defeated, far beyond burnout. I realized he hadn't witnessed what I had. He hadn't noticed Buddy like I did. Dr. Morris didn't see Buddy watching us, watching the bloody scene on the floor as if it was entertainment. But I did. I saw Buddy's eyes lingering on the gore pooling around my shoes. It was like he was enjoying it. Dr. Morris ran a hand over his face. We tried calling that weirdo owner again. The number's dead. He's dumped the dog here. That meant Buddy might be here for a while, possibly weeks if we had to find him a new home. I couldn't imagine lasting weeks with Buddy here. Jane caught my eye. I could tell she sensed something was off too. After we cleaned up as best as we could, the clinic fell into an uneasy calm. We were all traumatized, hollowed out by what we'd just seen. First the cattle dog, now the Dane. So much blood, so much horror. And through it all, Buddy sat in his kennel, not even touching his food, warm air blowing on him, watching. 2 more overhead lights burnt out as I mopped up the Dane's blood. The metallic scent of it clung to me no matter how many times I rinsed my arms. The towels we used soaked through, dyed a dark red, and Buddy didn't take his eyes off us the entire time. I kept telling myself I'd find a solution, that I just needed to think, but I could feel time running out. Later, as I was heaving a bundle of bloody towels into the laundry bin, I heard something. A voice, thick and bubbling, slurring through sounds no dog should make. It wasn't a normal bark or even a weird growl. It sounded like speech, a word gurgled through water. I froze, the towel slipping from my hands. The voice had tried to say a name. It tried to say my name. Ali soon, it seemed to moan, stretching and warping the syllables. My heart skipped. I turned, nausea twisting my stomach. Buddy was sitting in his kennel, jaws slack, drool hanging from his lips to the blanket. His pupils were huge, blacker than black, like they could swallow the light. I couldn't move. My mind scrambled for any logical explanation. I must have misheard, I thought. Maybe a vet tech said my name over the intercom, or some piece of equipment garbled a sound that resembled Allison. It had to be that, right? Then a stench hit me like a punch. Rot. Not the usual clinic smells of antiseptic or the musk of animals. This was the smell of decay, like forgotten meat in a trash can for weeks. It was the exact same foul odor that came in with Clint the first night. Only now I knew. It wasn't Clint that reeked. It was Buddy. I panicked. I grabbed all the dirty blankets and towels off the floor, shoved them into the bin and ran, slamming the lid shut. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. My mind screamed at me, "Don't turn your back on him." Clint's warning echoed in my head like a prophecy. "He's acting possessed," he had said. All the pieces snapped together. Buddy had tried to hurt Mark. Buddy had seemingly driven 2 dogs into lethal madness. And Buddy had said my name. He wanted to hurt me too. I was sure of it. I decided right then I wouldn't wait to see what Buddy did next. I was going to end this. I was going to kill Buddy. For the rest of that night's shift, I kept my head down and avoided Buddy's ward unless necessary. I moved like a robot through my tasks. My mind was racing ahead, planning what I had to do. During a quiet moment, I slipped into the medical supply room and drew up a large syringe of the strongest euthanasia solution we had. A bright pink liquid. Enough to put down a 200-pound dog, double Buddy's weight. Technically, doing this without authorization was a crime that could cost me my job, even my license, but I no longer cared. Deep in my bones, I felt that Buddy wasn't a normal dog, and that letting him live was dangerous. I hid the loaded syringe in my pocket and locked the drug cabinet, my heart thudding. I tried to act normal the rest of the shift. Dawn eventually arrived and I went home. I caught a few hours of restless sleep, then came back in the evening for my next shift. I was set on what I needed to do. When I walked in, the air at the clinic was thick with sorrow. People were sobbing quietly. I found out why. Mark had died. He went home to his trailer after the previous night's shift and took his own life sometime in the early morning. No note, no explanation. He was just gone. We were all stunned. Mark had been the friendly guy cracking jokes a day ago, and now this. Police had already come and gone by the time I learned the news. Everyone was reeling. I was heartbroken and furious all at once. I knew this was connected to Buddy. It had to be. Maybe Mark couldn't shake what happened. Maybe nightmares like mine drove him over the edge. Or maybe something worse followed him home. Either way, I felt a grim resolve harden inside me. I would not let there be any more victims. I pushed aside my grief and focused on the plan. I waited for a lull when the clinic was nearly empty and most co-workers were busy or on break. When I was alone and unobserved, I walked toward Buddy's kennel with purpose. Buddy watched me approach, head slightly tilted, eyes keen. It was as if he knew. I opened the kennel door slowly, syringe hidden in my hand. Buddy didn't growl or retreat. He almost looked expectant. I swiftly slipped the muzzle over his mouth before he could react, yanking the straps tight. My hands were steady, my movements confident in a way I hadn't felt before. I peeked around. Nobody was coming. The clinic was quiet except for distant phone ringing and muffled voices up front. I grabbed Buddy's foreleg firmly and felt for a vein. His skin was cold under my fingers. With my other hand, I slid the needle in and pushed the plunger. The pink fluid flowed into Buddy. Usually, euthanasia is peaceful and quick. The animal's heart slows. They lose consciousness, and they gently stop breathing within moments. But Buddy just sat there, muscles tense. I emptied the entire syringe, an amount that could drop a horse, into him. His heart should have stopped by the halfway mark. But Buddy did not collapse. He didn't even wobble. He stayed upright, eyes locked on mine. My own heartbeat thundered in my ears. This was impossible. By all accounts, Buddy should be dead or at least unconscious. I stared, my mouth dry. Buddy stared back, breathing evenly, unfazed. A cold wave of fear washed over me. This shouldn't be happening. The hallway lights flickered wildly then, snapping me back to the moment. One by one, the bulbs overhead burst out, plunging the ward into darkness. The heater in Buddy's kennel died with a click, and an oppressive silence fell. A faint green glow from the exit sign at the far end of the hallway cast just enough light to see shadows. Those shadows seemed to coil and twist unnaturally along the walls. I realized I was trapped in here with him. I couldn't see well, and my back was to the closed kennel door. Alisson. The drawn-out gargle of my name oozed from Buddy again, more clearly than before, sending ice through my veins. It wasn't just Buddy's eyes that seemed not right now. It was like something else was in here with me. I fumbled for the door latch behind me, hands slick with sweat. The smell of rot surged again, making me gag. My fingers slipped, unable to find the latch in the dark. Then I felt it, an icy, decaying hand gripping my ankle firmly. Thin, sharp nails dug through my scrubs into my skin. I screamed and jerked, but the grip was like iron. Electric static filled the air, raising the hairs on my arms. I pulled and the hand let go as suddenly as it had grabbed me. I bolted. In blind panic, I slammed myself into the kennel door behind me. It burst. open and I stumbled out into the pitch-black hall. Behind me, I heard the clang of metal, Buddy's kennel door smashing open, hitting the wall. Heavy paws hit the floor with a thud. He was free. My chest constricted with terror. I sprinted down the hall, adrenaline surging. I smacked into a wall, shoulder first, feeling around desperately for a doorknob to the next area. My hands found nothing, just smooth wall and closed doors without handles on this side. I was effectively locked in this corridor. The only sound was Buddy's claws tapping on the tile as he walked, not ran, toward me in the darkness. No growl, no bark. Just that steady, dreadful approach. He wasn't rushing. He knew I had nowhere to go. I pressed my back to the wall, sliding along it, trying to orient myself. My eyes started adjusting to the dark just a little, but not enough. I heard Buddy's breathing, wet and deep, disturbingly calm. Then a subtle shuffle. He was close. I felt the air change as he neared. I dashed away, blindly aiming for the staff locker area around the corner. Buddy's footsteps quickened behind me. It was like being chased by a phantom in a nightmare. You can hear it, but not really see it. I skidded into the locker room, which had some emergency power. A dim red glow from a backup light cast long shadows. I ripped open my locker and groped inside for my purse. Buddy's presence loomed at the locker room entrance. I sensed a hulking shape fill the doorway behind me. The smell of decay grew overpowering, and I heard a low, almost amused pant. My fingers finally closed around the cold metal of my gun. I yanked it out, spun around, and without hesitation, I fired into the darkness at Buddy. The muzzle flash lit up the scene in bursts. Buddy crouched mid-stride, teeth glinting behind the muzzle straps, eyes reflecting red. The first shot made him flinch, but he stayed up. I fired again and again. On the third shot, I saw a bullet tear into his shoulder, a spray of blood, but Buddy didn't fall. It was as if pain didn't register to him. His lips were drawn back in that awful grin, even as dark blood oozed from where I'd hit him. I kept pulling the trigger, the gunshots thunderous in the enclosed space. On the sixth and final shot, one bullet struck the side of Buddy's head with a nasty, wet sound. Part of his skull shattered inward, his face partially blew apart, jaw hanging askew, tongue lolling out. Even then, he still did not drop instantly. Buddy's body twitched violently, head jerking in a way that wasn't natural, like a puppet on tangled strings. A thick, horrible pop came from him, echoing off the tiles. He staggered, took a half step, then finally collapsed to the floor. I stood there, arms locked outstretched with the empty gun, shaking from head to toe. My ears rang from the gunfire, the smell of gunpowder mixed with the rot in the air. My eyes were locked on Buddy's fallen form. In the faint red light, I could see the pool of blood spreading around his ruined head. Suddenly, bright flashlight beams and shouting voices flooded into the hallway. Security and other staff rushed in, drawn by the shots. Someone grabbed my arm and pulled me back. The overhead lights flickered and buzzed, then blazed on. Power had been restored somehow, or maybe it was never really out, except around Buddy. In the harsh fluorescent light, I saw what I had done clearly. Bullet holes pockmarked the wall and one in the floor tile. Buddy lay motionless, his black fur matted with blood. The muzzle I'd strapped on him was gone. He must have ripped it off during the chase. His eyes stared blankly ahead. The side of his head was caved in. My stomach churned, but I felt a grim satisfaction, too. Chaos followed. People were everywhere, shouting, some crying out at the gore, police showing up before I even fully processed things. They took the gun from my trembling hands and separated me to a quiet room. I was numb as I explained in a broken voice that Buddy attacked me in the dark, that I feared for my life. It was the truth, even if I omitted the more unbelievable parts. Self-defense. I stuck to that story. Given the fresh injuries on my ankle from those ghostly nails and the earlier bizarre animal deaths that had everyone on edge, the police accepted it. They let me go that night without charges, telling me not to leave town in case they needed me. Buddy's body was bagged up and put into our clinic's freezer to await a necropsy or cremation. The clinic closed for the rest of the night. They'd have a lot to clean and repair come morning. I went home. I scrubbed myself in the shower for an hour, but still felt unclean. I sat in silence for a day, trying to purge the memory of Buddy's voice and the feel of that deathly hand on me. Nothing really helped. When it was time to return to work after a short leave, I was a mess, but determined to push through. The morning I was due back, the phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. Probably an insurance or legal follow-up, I thought. I answered, voice raw from lack of sleep. For a moment there was just heavy breathing on the line. Then a familiar voice slithered through, one I never expected to hear again. A slow, lazy drawl, but with a cruel edge. "You shouldn't have killed it, little lady," the voice on the phone said with a low chuckle. My heart turned to ice. It was Clint. I couldn't speak. My tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth. Clint's breathing rattled, and he let out a low laugh that built into something crazed, halfway between a laugh and a snarl. The sound made my skin crawl. His voice dropped into a mocking sing-song. "You've just gone and made things so much worse." He dissolved into manic laughter, whooping and hollering like this was the funniest joke in the world. The phone call cut off with an abrupt click, but I still heard his laughter echoing in my head. I slowly lowered the phone, hand trembling. My apartment felt colder, darker. Clint's words replayed over and over, made things so much worse. How had he gotten my number? And what did he mean worse? Deep inside, I felt a dread that this wasn't over, that maybe Buddy was only part of something larger, something that I had now angered or unleashed by killing him. For reasons I couldn't explain, I believed Clint. I had stopped one nightmare, but perhaps invited another. As I sat there in the morning light, phone still clutched tight, I realized that the true horror might not have been Buddy at all, but whatever controlled Buddy. And if that thing was still out there, maybe now angry and looking for a new host, then my worst nightmare was likely yet to come.